There we go. So as we go through today, what we are going to talk about and review is some brief history of Watermist, the concept, what Watermist actually is, what codes and standards apply to this technology, and then look at some specifics out of the International Building Fire Code, NFPA 1, as well as the Life Safety Code 101, and how they address the use of Watermist as an alternative fire protection system. And then we'll look at briefly the types of systems that Plumis offers and where we stand on the testing and listing of the various Plumis systems as of today. So first, with a little history, this is interesting to look at this, and when you get into conversations about Watermist, some people first reaction is that this is a technology that was just recently discovered, when in fact, if we do just a little bit of research, we find that there was actually a report published back in the 1940s by the old National Board of Fire Underwriters that was entitled Fire Extinguishment Using Finely Divided Water. And if you actually read that report, you realize that it's talking about the same technology that we're talking about here with the Plumis systems. Also in that time frame, in the 40s and the 50s, in the 1945 February issue of Fire Engineering, publication that's still around today, they had an article that described the use of Watermist for shipboard firefighting, research that was done with the U.S. Coast Guard, and that was one of the first uses in that Watermist technology, and again that goes back to 1945. And then as we start to kind of involve the fire service into this concept of finely divided water, in 1950, Chief Lloyd Lehman actually presented a research paper entitled Little Drops of Water at the Fire Department Instructors Conference, what we know as FDIC, in Memphis, Tennessee. And again, these were all things that were taking place in the 1940s and the 1950s. So this concept of Watermist, of breaking the water down, is not anything new. It's just that I guess we could say we've kind of rediscovered the idea. And in the 1990s, there was a resurgence in looking at this technology, and a lot more research was done at that point. Again, at this time, the use of Watermist technology was thought of more as a way to protect special hazards. Obviously, the marine environment was one of those, and then they started to look at protecting localized special hazards like turbines, large generator sets, things like that. And so we have gone from the 1940s and the 50s and kind of the birth of the idea to the 1990s, where the research picked back up, again looking at special hazards, but as people began to look at the technology, realize that it could be expanded beyond the use in just a marine environment or for just special localized hazards in protecting larger hazards and including protecting entire buildings. The other interesting part for some of the folks that have been around in the fire service for a while, there was a fire apparatus company called John Bean that advertised and developed a high pressure fire apparatus, and they really had their most popularity, again, starting in the 40s up to about the mid-70s. Their pumps were operating in the 600 to 850 PSI range. It kind of fell out of disfavor. However, it's again like what we're seeing in fixed fire protection systems, we're starting to see the use of high pressure in manual firefighting come back into play again. Again, this was research that was done in this case by the Air Force, looking at apparatus that was operating in the 1100 to 1400 psi range, flowing relatively low amounts of water, given it as fire apparatus, 18 to 22 gallons a minute, or a little bit more than that if they were going through a turret. And in a way, we can say they rediscovered the wheel, that they found some of the same things that were discovered back with the original research back in the 40s and the 50s, that when you break these water molecules down into a more finer mist, the more effective that they become in fire suppression, and we don't need the volume of water that we need with a typical fire suppression system or manual firefighting. By definition, water mist is less than 100 microns in size, or excuse me, 1,000 microns in size at the design pressure at the nozzle. And that's kind of put in perspective with this graphic, as you can look at it, how large a human hair is, and also compared to what a micron is, realizing that by definition it is less than 1,000 microns in size. So we are taking our agent, in this case water, and we're breaking it down into a very, very fine mist. And for all of the science and the engineering that is going on, it really comes down to the more finely that we break this up, the more effective it becomes at heat absorption, and the more effective it becomes as a fire suppression agent. And because it's much more effective, we don't need as much of it. We drop the volume of water, the quantity, down dramatically when we start to use the water mist technology. So the question often comes in when we get into discussions with folks about this water mist technology, is where in the codes does it allow me to use this new approach? And there actually is a standard developed through the National Fire Protection Association's consensus standards process, which is NFPA 750. This committee that is responsible for this document was formed in the 1990s, and has gone through obviously several revisions since the original document was done. One of the most significant changes is in the recent editions, when they added into the 750 document specific requirements, sections, chapters, whatever you would like to call them, specifically for residential occupancies. One of the other things to remember about 750 is it is like other water-based standards. It deals with the design and the installation. Once you go beyond the original acceptance testing, a water mist system designed and installed in accordance to NFPA 750 is maintained on a routine basis in accordance with NFPA 25, as all of our other water-based systems are. Currently, the 2015 edition is the most current edition of NFPA 750. That document is in a current revision schedule, so the next edition would be the 2018. But right now the 2015 is the one that's on the street, currently in play. So we do have an industry standard for this. The next part of the discussion is where within the other codes do we get to NFPA 750? In other words, how do we use water mist as what the codes refer to as an alternative fire protection approach? If we look at the various codes, we could probably break down their approaches to this. One is it's an engineered solution, which is going to be a very hazard site-specific approach. Then we have a performance-based solution, again, which is an engineering type approach. And the other one, the one that folks are most commonly familiar with, what we use every day, would be the prescriptive code compliance solution. In other words, there's language actually in the documents that allow us to use the NFPA 750 water-based approach. If we look for a moment at the engineered and the performance approaches, this is what's dealt with in the codes. In the NFPA documents, they refer to it as equivalencies. In the International Building and Fire Code, the terminology is alternate materials and methods. But they both accomplish the same thing, and that is that these prescriptive documents say that there's nothing there that is intended to prevent the use of systems, devices, etc., that are equivalent to or superior to what is prescribed. And it also recognizes that nothing in those documents is intended to restrict or prevent the use of new technologies as long as we meet the intent. As we all know, if you spend just a little bit of time in the code enforcement world, that the development of technology, in this case, of course, we're talking about Watermist, but it can occur in a lot of different areas. But a lot of times the technology is way ahead of what the prescriptive codes actually talk about. So this engineered and performance-based approach, the equivalency or alternate material and method, is one way to get to Watermist as that new technology, as long as we meet the intent. The other traditional approach is the prescriptive approach. It's the one probably that most folks are more comfortable with, because the code actually has language in it that prescribes what we are allowed to do or what is permitted to be done. In the International Building Code, the document that is widely used now, not only in the United States but around the world, specifically recognizes the use of alternate automatic fire extinguishing systems. This is a section in the building code that is quite often overlooked, because when people are using the code and we're looking, does this building need fire protection, fire suppression, we're typically looking at those sections that are talking about the building having to have sprinklers in this environment. And so everybody kind of focuses on, well, it says I must have automatic sprinklers. But if we go back essentially to the first part of the chapter, chapter 9 in the building code and in the international fire codes, there is a section, specifically 9042, that provides that automatic fire extinguishing systems installed as an alternative to the required sprinkler systems, first off, have to be approved by the code official. Pretty common approach. When we go to section 904, we find that chapter 9, the chapter that people typically go to for, is the building required to be sprinklered? If we look in the earlier portions of that chapter, we find that it specifically permits the use of automatic water mist systems, provided that the application that is being considered is consistent with the applicable listing or approvals, and then provides a number of other requirements through sections 904, 11.1 through 3. And out of those, the most important one is the fact that there is a reference in the International Building Code specifically to NFPA 750. And the building code is now allowing the use of water mist to be used as an alternative to sprinklers, provided that it's installed in accordance with NFPA 750 and the manufacturer's instructions. It is also interesting that the ICODES, the building and the fire codes, have included a definition of an automatic water mist system. And it has some similarities, as you can see, to what a sprinkler system has. It consists of a water supply, consists of a pressure source, and a distribution piping system with attached nozzles, which at or above the minimum operating pressure, defined by its listing, discharges water in fine droplets, and this is the real important part of this, meeting the requirements of NFPA 750 for the purposes of control, suppression, or extinguishment. Systems can include wet pipe, dry pipe, pre-action. They can be engineered, pre-engineered, local application, or total flooding. Now there's a lot of things in that definition. First off, I want to go back to where it says the purpose. Control, suppression, or extinguishment. When we're dealing with water mist, one of those issues in the bigger picture of water mist is that a system could be designed just to control the fire. Control in the concept of NFPA 750 means that we prevent the fire from getting any larger. We essentially hold the heat release in check. We're not making necessarily get any smaller, but we're not letting it get any bigger. When we go to suppression in water mist world, suppression in water mist means that we are reducing the heat release rate. We're making the fire smaller. And ultimately extinguishment, which is completely eliminating the heat release rate. When we look at our Plumis systems, we are in that extinguishment mode. The other point I would like to make with all this, because obviously wet pipe, dry pipe are pretty much self-explanatory, is that idea of local application or total flooding systems. A few moments ago when we started the introduction, we mentioned that in the early days, water mist was intended for these special hazards, like a turbine, generator set, things of that nature, where we were not protecting the entire room, we were protecting just a specific hazard, a piece of equipment. Compared to total flooding, when we talk about total flooding in water mist, the way to think about that, the way to put that in context, is that's what we do with sprinklers. We protect the entire room, the entire building, as opposed to just a portion of it. There have been some new sections added to both the IBC and IFC. Again, specifically talking about water mist systems, shall be permitted. And again, these sections refer to NFPA 750 and, more importantly, the manufacturer's instructions. In the NFPA family, if we look at NFPA 1, which some jurisdictions use as an alternative to the International Fire Code, the NFPA 1 document again has a section in it, specifically 13.8, entitled Other Fire Protection Systems. And as you can see, it says where other fire protection systems are required to be installed by the provisions of this code, or installed with the approval of the authority having jurisdiction as an alternative or equivalency, the design and installation of these systems shall comply with the appropriate standards. One of the standards listed is NFPA 750. So this provision in NFPA 1 is doing the same thing that those sections that are in the IBC and IFC are doing, and that is that if I have a prescriptive requirement for sprinklers, these sections allow the authority having jurisdiction, the code official, to consider and allow the use of Watermist as an alternative fire protection system, provided that it meets NFPA 750 criteria and it meets the manufacturer's instructions. From NFPA 1, we go to the Life Safety Code, or NFPA 101, and the language in NFPA 101, while the section number is a little different, here we're in section 981, it is exactly the same language essentially as what was in the Fire Prevention Code, in that where I have a requirement prescribed for some other fire protection system, I am allowed to use Watermist as an alternative. So what we are seeing at this point is that in the building code, in the International Fire Code, in NFPA 1, and in NFPA 101, when we have a mandatory requirement for sprinklers through these sections, it is permitted to use Watermist systems provided that they meet the criteria of NFPA 750 and the manufacturer's instructions or design criteria. So what does NFPA 750 do when we're specifically talking about the residential type occupancies? In other words, how does 750 compare to the criteria for sprinkler systems? As I mentioned as we were getting started, one of the changes that was made more recently to NFPA 750 is that they incorporated language into the Watermist standard specifically for residential occupancies. And they have defined this in the same way that the sprinkler standards define these types of occupancies. So one of the things that they incorporated into NFPA 750 was a section on residential occupancies up to and including 4 stories in height. That's exactly the same criteria that we use in NFPA 13R. And what is interesting when we look at this is what's the intent of a Watermist system in a residential occupancy up to and including 4 stories in height? Apartments, hotels, motels, things of that nature. And very clearly and importantly that it's the purpose of this section to provide a Watermist system that aids in the detection and control of a residential fire and thus provides improved protection against injury, life loss, and property damage. They specifically point out that this Watermist system in a residential occupancy up to 4 stories in height is designed and installed to prevent flashover of the room of origin where the Watermist protection system is provided and to improve the chance for occupants to escape or to be evacuated. That is exactly the same performance criteria that we have had in the residential sprinkler environment, in this case 13R, since those requirements were first enacted. This is essentially a life safety system at this approach. We're controlling the fire, we're improving the time that is available for the occupants to safely escape. In other words, we're giving them more of what is known as ASET, or available safe egress time. We're preventing flashover in the room of origin. So here we have residential occupancies up to and including 4 stories in height. They also included a section specifically to 1 and 2 family dwellings. Again, a system that aids in the detection and control of residential fires and improves protection against injury and life loss, prevents flashover, gives the occupants more time to escape or to be evacuated. Again, when we look at this criteria, this performance criteria, we can see that the intent, the purpose of Watermist is exactly the same as what we have established in the residential sprinkler environment, in this case, in what would be an NFPA 13D. Now, there are obviously residential occupancies that are not 1 and 2 family dwellings or are more than 4 stories in height. In the sprinkler world, that would put us back into NFPA 13 and particularly would put us into the category of light hazard systems in the 13 world. The NFPA 750 document also incorporated the language for that, and looking at light and ordinary systems that shall be installed in accordance with the listed design, installation, operation, and maintenance manual. So again, what NFPA 750 has incorporated is that if we had a residential type occupancy that was greater than the 4-story limit allowed, then there are provisions that allow us to use the Watermist technology. Essentially, we could put it in a high-rise residential occupancy and protect those ordinary hazards that must also be present. One of the other issues that often comes up in these discussions is, well, I've got codes and I have standards. So we need to spend a few moments in looking at what is this relationship, because these are some very important differences. We could describe the building code, if we stick with this discussion in the IBC world, as kind of the parent document. It is the document that prescribes what must be done. In comparison to the various NFPA documents, in this case standards, which set forth requirements on how to do something. So another way to phrase this is a code is written in imperative language. It says shall, and it tells us where and when something must be done. So in code world, we have the International Building Code. It's shall, tells us where and when that something must be done. The International Fire Code, same way. NFPA 1, shall, where and when. The Life Safety Code, where and when things must be done. The standards could be things such as the various sprinkler standards, 13, 13D, 13R, and specific to our discussion this morning, NFPA 750. These are standards. The standards are typically adopted by reference through the codes. As we mentioned a few moments ago, NFPA 750 is referenced in all of our codes. 750 then tells you how to accomplish something, how to do something that the code says that thou must do. That starts to look at this relationship between the two of these. So if we look at this in this hierarchy of codes and standards, it's the building code or the fire code or the life safety code that permits the use of various fire suppression systems, or the term that we saw discussed in the code documents was alternative fire protection. This allowance to be able to use alternative fire protection is in the codes, It is not in the referenced NFPA standards, as an example 13R. One would not expect to go into NFPA 13R, which is the standard on sprinklers in residential occupancies up to and including 4 stories in height. We wouldn't expect to find in 13R any criteria for water mist, any more than we would expect that if we picked up a copy of NFPA 13, would we find criteria for a clean agent system that is designed and installed in accordance to NFPA 2001. And this is a very important philosophical piece of information to remember, that it is the code that it is telling us where we must do something and what must be done, and the code allows us to use the alternatives. Because we know there has been some confusion sometimes when we have discussed water mist systems. People begin to look in, well, where in 13 or 13R or 13D does it tell me that I can use water mist? As we've described, that's not in the standards. It is the code that allows us to use the alternatives. The standards are system specific. The code is much broader. The code is that parent document. In the hierarchy of things, the code is what's on top that tells us where and when we can do something, where we can use alternatives, and makes NFPA 750 water mist one of those acceptable alternatives that we have in today's fire protection selection equipment. So we've seen now where the codes allow an alternative approach, specifically referencing NFPA 750 and the manufacturer's instructions. The question would be now, what type of equipment, what type of systems does Plumis have in its portfolio? What's in our toolbox that is available to be installed in, particularly in this type of residential environment? What we have is a compact pump unit. This is probably, and put in perspective, it is probably physically about the size of a typical computer CPU. Runs off standard household current, 110 volts. Connects directly to the potable water supply in the building. Does not require a special water main. If you have enough water to meet the domestic demands required by the plumbing code, you more than have an adequate water supply for any of these Plumis water mist systems. The pump delivers its water to the heads through high pressure hoses. Look a lot like the hoses that you use on your power washer, if we want to put them in perspective. But a completely self-contained unit. Again, one of the real benefits to this system is that we don't need a separate water meter. We don't need more water than what we need for the domestic. Runs off of that tap, runs off of standard household power, and uses much, much less water. We're talking about a flow rate of a little over a gallon per minute, about 1,400 PSI. Very, very effective. Goes back to those original ideas that we mentioned when we first started, breaking that water down into a very, very fine mist makes it much more efficient at heat absorption. One of the ways that we operate these systems, and this head that we see here in the wall right here, is a very unique approach. Unlike other water mist systems, unlike sprinkler systems that have heads in the ceiling, the Automist system uses a wall-mounted head to deliver the mist. And incorporated into that head is a very unique approach, infrared heat sensing technology. So once the heat detector in the room activates, it tells the circuits back at the pump unit there's something potentially going on, and the head operates in a scanning mode looking for the heat signature in the room. And that doesn't necessarily just have to be the flame itself. As you can see on this slide, it's looking for the entire heat signature, so that if I have a fire, as it's depicted on this particular slide, that's somewhat shielded, the flame itself is shielded, I'm getting a heat signature on the walls and the ceiling that this head can see, the infrared sensor. So it scans the room looking for that spot. Then the head rotates and locks at that location, directing the mist directly at the seat of the fire. We have done a lot of testing has been done on these systems. There has been extensive testing done to the European standards in the UK, meets all of those criteria. Here in the United States, QDOT Engineering has done some additional testing. We have done kitchen fires with actual grease, which was one of the requests by fire officials. We've looked at coffee makers. We've looked at dryers. We've looked at nearly every type of fire scenario that you can imagine in that residential environment to see how the Plumis Automist system would work. And as shown with the testing out of the UK, our testing has further documented the efficiency of these systems in our laboratory tests. This just shows some of the various testing that has been done with the Automist Smart Scan system. And we're comparing, in this case, the Watermist system on the left with a traditional residential sprinkler on the right. You can see that the Automist system, because of its functionality, activated much sooner. And used 90% less water than the residential sprinkler environment. Obviously, we all know that without any kind of fire suppression, the conditions can deteriorate very, very quickly and become untenable. We have in the graph showing the activation of the heat detectors in the Automist system. These heat detectors can either be hardwired to the pump unit, or easier installation is to use the wireless method. The heat detector activates, the head scans the room, finds the hot spot, discharges the water on that, and as you can see, all of the Automist activation, including the application of the Watermist, is activating before the sprinkler activates in the same type of environment. The listing of the systems often becomes a question. The Plumis systems, as I mentioned a while ago, have been extensively tested to the European standards. Obviously, Underwriters Laboratories is going to want to do their own tests in their own system, but we have no reservations that the system will meet that criteria. based on what we have seen, based upon discussions, that will take place. But I do want to go back to the language that was in the codes, tying that to this listing issue. You could see that the language in the codes was predicated upon the system being installed in accordance to NFPA 750, meeting the intent of NFPA 750, and the manufacturer's instructions. So with the test data that we have, and we look at that test data, we know that we meet the NFPA 750 criteria. We have the manufacturer's criteria that's set forth in the manuals. There is sufficient documentation as of right now without the UL listing to allow a code official to consider and permit the use of the Automist systems as an alternative fire protection system to sprinklers based upon the language that's currently in the codes. The UL listing is going to be gravy on top of that. There is a version of the Automist that's called the Personal Protection System. This is a self-contained system that is used for the protection of folks that are in our really high hazard categories, i.e. someone that may be under home health care, hospice care, something like that. Totally separate system, self-contained system. It has its own water tank, it has the pump, it has a battery backup unit, the head and the detector are all part of this portable system. And the other unique feature of the Automist PPS is that it has a cell phone connection, which can be programmed to notify the fire department or other appropriate agencies that the system has actually activated. So the fire department is then en route. It can also be set up to know that if the power has failed or other things that have gone anything offline with the unit, we can get notification of that. But that's a very unique feature of this, that it has that cell phone connection capability. This Automist PPS came about because of some concern, again in the UK, about individuals that had a degree of being incapable of self-preservation, again the home health care, the hospice situation, and primarily if the ignition scenario was intimate with the person. In other words, their clothing was first involved. So this particular system, the PPS, is designed specifically for that, with that type of environment. We have a little video demonstration here. There we go. So we can see that the system has picked up the presence of that fire. It is giving a notable audification right now. Basically, put the fire out or the system is going to activate, and then it gives you a countdown. The nozzle, then if that condition is not cleared, then the system discharges, as you can see, and it discharges quickly enough in that fashion, even to protect when we have the individual being intimate with the ignition. In the bigger picture, we can see here where we've got a fire that is relatively shielded in the corner, being protected by the Automist PPS system. And because it directs it directly into that corner, then it's very, very effective. Even the fire is somewhat shielded. Here we have our folks from the York City Fire Department here in York, Pennsylvania. They have a couple of these systems in their protection approach for help protect the community. As I said, it's completely self-contained. It contains a water tank, the nozzle, connects to a standard 110 volt receptacle, choice of flame, heat, or detectors, alerts the fire department, has the battery backup, completely self-contained. It is reusable. Because this is a system that is designed to protect our high challenge audiences, these high risk individuals, which every community has and could be aware of through EMS calls, lift assist calls, notification from home health care or anybody that's dealing with these folks, to know that those folks are present in your community. Obviously, protecting this high challenge or high risk audience is something that would fall within the purviews of the fire grants that are available. So we are looking for partners to work with this system. We know specifically that the PPS system is eligible for the fire grant program. So if you have these risks in your community that you have identified, the fire grants could provide you with the method to be able to acquire these and to be able to protect that high risk, high challenge audience within your community. It's completely reusable. So you're not physically installing it in one location and it's never going to come out again. It could be moved from home to home as the situation could dictate for you. So you have the contact information if you go to our website, which is Plumis.com. In the upper right hand corner of that page, just make sure that you are checked on the US side. There are two websites there. One of them is the UK version, one of them is the US version. So just check on the US and you will get all of the information. There is extensive technical information on the website. There is all of our contact information on the website for all of these systems. Hopefully now that you can see that the Watermist idea, the Watermist concept, the technology is clearly acceptable under the current standards and the codes, and we hope that we can help you out. We hope that you follow along with this technology. We will have further webinars on these issues and other technical matters in the months to come, and hope that you come back and visit with us. So we thank you for listening this morning. And as it says, you will get a email with a survey. Once you've completed that survey, then that kicks in the methodology where you get your certificate. As you can see on the screen, we are an ICC preferred educational provider. So therefore your attendance in the webinar this morning does give you specific ICC credits if you have some certifications through them to help you maintain those. Again, thanks everyone for listening this morning, and we'll see you in the future.